Happy Lunch and Learn, everyone. It's good to see everyone here today. Very happy to see all of you. I want to say I'm sorry that we started a few minutes late. I had sent the wrong link inadvertently to Rabbi Bisno. If everyone could also put on your mute, that would be great, except for Rabbi Bisno. But if everyone else can, I'm going to mute all, and then I will unmute Aaron. Okay. There you go. So everyone, it's great to see you. Hope you're all doing well. I hope that you are all staying safe and staying healthy. And it's great to see so many people here. So we are here for our second Kahn-Versations with Rabbi Kahn, and that's me. And I am so thrilled to have my dear friend and classmate from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, Rabbi Aaron Bisno, who is, this is quite the title, the Francis F. and David R. Levin Senior Rabbinic Pulpit, which means Senior Rabbi. And he arrived in Pittsburgh. Some of you know, Aaron, just so you know, our friend Steve Goldson over here grew up at Rodef Shalom in Philly, which I understand you also worked at for your first job.
Right.
And no, you didn't grow up at Rodef. You grew up at KI, Steve, or was it Rodef? I'm sorry, I put you on the spot. Rodef, you grew up at Rodef. Oh, I have to give you permission to unmute yourself. That's right, I'm so sorry. Let me go back here, and I'm going to hopefully
that's Nate, Danny, where are you on the screen? There you are.
Unmute.
Well, welcome.
Steve Moore. Josh, can you figure out how to let everyone unmute themselves? Thank you. Steve, we'll get back to you later. Let me get back to introducing our guest. So Rabbi Bisno has been in Pittsburgh since 2004, I believe. So about a year after I got here, when we got our big boy and big girl rabbi jobs. We were both ordained from HUC JIR in 1995, Rabbi Bisno in Cincinnati, and I was in New York. And I thought it would be interesting today, given what's going on in the country and what has been going on the last several years. Rabbi Bisno works literally half a mile or less from Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. And I thought, as we look back on October 27th of 2018, that we would discuss the events of that day, the weeks following. Just as a brief introduction, Rabbi Bisno has a very long bio, and I'm not going to go through all of it today because I don't want to take up too much time. But I want you to know personally, and it's not because we're friends and because we kind of grew up together, it's because I really feel this. I think Rabbi Bisno is very well known, not just for his pastoral care and ability to lead a very large and historic urban reform congregation, but he's also very well known for his scholarship and his ecumenical work. And by that, I mean he is incredibly active and passionately involved with the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh, with the interfaith community, not just in Pittsburgh, but in Pennsylvania. And he has writes beautifully, was just published last week in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. More of that will probably evolve as we go on. Our goal today is from now until about 12:30, 12:35. I'm going to have a conversation with Rabbi Bisno, and then we'll leave a good 20, 25 minutes for questions and answers. So Rabbi Bisno, without further ado, on October 27th, 2018, I woke up, I was getting ready for Torah study and for our bar mitzvah that morning. Given the time change, time difference of 3 hours, you had already texted me and all of our friends. We have a group of about 6 of us that went to rabbi school. We text each other regularly. It's kind of what's gotten us through the pandemic because they're quite funny. But Aaron sent a text to all of us saying, I'm in my synagogue and I am on lockdown. And I think there was a bar mitzvah going on as well.
No, baby naming, yeah. But
Baby naming. So Aaron, please kind of walk us through that day, and if you would, and then sort of what happened in that whirlwind of the following weeks.
yeah, wow, thanks. And thanks for this introduction. It occurred to me that we were in Jerusalem for our first year in 1991. So that was 30 years ago. Yes. So happy birthday, 30 years, wow, amazing. So 2 years ago, in a few months, October 27th, Shabbat morning, we were all going about our business. We'd had our Torah study. We're approaching the start of our 10:30 service. It was just before 10, and people started getting text messages or little bits of information, but not everyone had it. We went into the service. We were aware that something was happening. Our congregation is located on a main thoroughfare that leads into Squirrel Hill from one of the directions, certainly from the area of the hospitals. We heard lots of sirens going by, and then quickly we were informed that we were on lockdown. By then the service was up and running. People were starting to continue to get more messages. There was greater concern. There was a concern that was clearly palpable about whether we knew on the pulpit what was coming into the folks in the pews. And we would give updates because not everyone was carrying a phone or not carrying a phone that was on. So the irony of that juxtaposition wasn't lost on any of us either, that even in those moments, we're very much plugged in, right? Or our phones notify us when whoever it is believes that it's time for you to have this information, you receive it. And we're just not so comfortable being without our phones. And so service is interrupted, even as it's obviously focused on, if not the otherworldly, the here and now, and yet we're aware of what's happening elsewhere. And then it becomes clear that the story that's unfolding, same information you're getting at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever time it is earlier in the morning, there is a local story, which becomes all the more frightening as people then imagine how close they live, or who's a frequent attendee there, or perhaps there's a bar bat mitzvah going on there. There wasn't that morning, as you know, and we're just getting more. I don't know, we brought our service to a conclusion sooner than we might otherwise have. We were giving various updates that we were on lockdown, but there was nowhere safer to be given that we were all inside and the perimeter was secure. We brought it quickly to a conclusion. We had a lunch and learn schedule for afterwards, which we obviously suspended, and we brought the televisions in and people began watching because we were locked down for another hour or so. The family continued to have its luncheon celebration because why should they not have that? But appetites weren't what they were.
Did you? But just to interrupt you quickly, did you have officers come into the synagogue at that point?
I guess by then they had, right, at the front desk, or they'd secured. We had a certain amount of staff on, or we had a catering service that was in the building, or right, just to make sure that everyone understood they were to stay inside now. That's essentially what lockdown means when you're inside, right? And they've got this, so we'll let you know when it's.
No, but I mean, I didn't know, if they were concerned that there were going to be other live shooters looking at other synagogues at that point.
I suspect they were concerned about that, but it became clear, I think, that there was no threat here, right? This was a lone gunman. But I can tell you that contemporaneous with this, my friends who are in emergency medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, just down the block, were ready for mass casualties, and were ready for all, which didn't come about because it was so deadly that while there are a few people who were injured, it wasn't a mass casualty, a mass injury event. It is a mass casualty event. 2 bishops came over, the Catholic bishop, David Zubik, and the Episcopal bishop, Dorsey McConnell, came over to just show solidarity or to be with us. That was very gratifying. And then as we were allowed to leave, my phone began to ring with journalists who, from around the world or from national media, who were fascinated by this story, right? And pretty soon the area around Tree of Life, which is on my way home, is cordoned off. It very quickly went from being a Pittsburgh police crime scene to being a federal controlled crime scene where the Pittsburgh police just went to the exterior of the perimeter. And then the news vortex kicked in. The community came together, and that became the story that you'd be completely forgiven if you couldn't remember that it was on October 27th, 2018. It's now just Pittsburgh, right? It's just sort of eponymously named the way Parkland or Poway or pick the alphabetical acrostic, the letter comes immediately to mind, but the date as to when it happened. We have nephews in Parkland, and they go to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School, and my son asks me a couple of weeks after the shooting here, the killings here, whether this was the largest number of people killed since Parkland. I said, I'm abashed. I can't keep them all straight, right? It's only actually since COVID and since schools being suspended that in April of 2020, we had the first month without a school shooting in years. The schools
Can everyone see the shared screen? Because I'd like to show one of the clips real quick, Aaron, if that's okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
Can you see this MSNBC YouTube screen? Can you see what I'm on the shared screen? Is that coming up? Yep.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
there.
Yes.
It's there.
We don't have volume. This was about whether or not the President Trump should come to Pittsburgh or come to Squirrel Hill. And there were a lot
Did you say you don't have volume?
Right, we're not hearing your.
Oh, you're not. That's weird. It's not on mute. Let me try it again.
No audio.
No audio. Okay. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to go get Josh and he'll figure that out. All right, keep going, Aaron. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, it just became sort of a surreal thing, right? Being in the center of this international story that then came to personify anti-Semitism in this country. I say I think there are three myths that I grew up with. I'm your rabbi's age, 52, that I grew up with that I'm not raising, I don't suspect Steve is raising his kids with, three myths that no longer exist. And this is the third of them. The first is that every generation will do better than the previous one. If you just work hard in this country, that's what the American Jewish immigrant myth suggested, right? That each subsequent generation can do better than the one that came before it. We all hope that it will be true for our own children or grandchildren, but it's not a foregone conclusion any longer. That myth is over. The second is that America is the light to all the nations, or the exemplary model, or right. When Steve and I went to Israel, it was fashionable to sew an American flag on your duffel bag or your backpack. But no one would be well advised to travel through the world or Europe today with an American flag on your backpack. That wouldn't win you any friends, right? So that's over. And the third is that it can't happen here. Whatever it is in your own mind, it's now clear to everybody that it surely can happen here. And that myth is over. And that became clear, at least with regards to anti-Semitism, after Pittsburgh, right? And so that's a strange thing, because you call it corn, we call it maize. You call it Pittsburgh, we call it October 27th. And since then, there's a before and an after with regard to how we think about shul business, right? Whether it's security or whether it's just a sense of not being able to be anything less than vigilant, which is exhausting, right? And it's draining financially and emotionally, and doesn't seem to be that's the real story, but that's part of now the American Jewish reality. So anyway, back to you, Steve. You're muted.
Can you talk to me just a little bit about, I know that there was an event, and you've had so much more time, the benefit of hindsight now, but there was an event at Tree of Life, I believe, the Shabbat before or 2 weeks before, that was hosted by Hias, which is probably, if not the oldest, one of the oldest Jewish immigration. It was originally intended, I believe it was founded by German Jews in the mid-19th century, and meant to help Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Between 1880 and 1930, there were, 3 million Jews that immigrated. And there was an event hosted by Hias that precipitated this particular shooter. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned?
Yeah, so Hias, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, sponsored a Shabbat, and Tree of Life Congregation, like surely many congregations around the country, participated in that national Shabbat in the same way as the Reform movement sometimes designates a certain Shabbat for, I don't know, whatever it may be, right? The cause of the week. And which isn't to diminish it, and we mean to suggest that, right? We all agree tonight's Sister Shabbat. We all agree next week is Organ Donor Shabbat. This week is Hias Shabbat. And
We actually have sent the senior rabbi to Hawaii Shabbat, but we haven't been able to schedule it because of the. By the way, everyone who attends, they get to go to Hawaii too, because I think why not do Shabbat on Maui? I think
Right, and why not vacation with your congregants? Because who better? Right.
That's right.
Okay, so they did a highest Shabbat, and evidently that stoked the anger, the ire, right, of this misbegotten. I don't want to say he's a one-off, but it played into the rhetoric, which we know is pervasive or has been over the last number of years in our country, about the threats that immigrants pose, right? And all of the terrible things that are ascribed to immigrants as a general catch-all. And so it was that he decided to come to the Tree of Life Synagogue and make it clear to them his opposition to such an embrace of the immigrant.
Right. And was that a community program? Meaning, did you co-sponsor that, or was that just, like you said, a special Shabbat just for that shul?
That was that congregation Shabbat, right? Like all of our programs, we'd love if the larger community appreciated and wanted to come share it, but it was just an otherwise ordinary Friday evening where, I don't know, the sermon was about the program or the literature was given out at the Oneg. I mean, really, that, right? We all know these kinds of programs. That's about what it was. Mm-hmm. Now, it's clearly in the key, right? It's not that every congregant, every member signed off on it, but it's in keeping with the ethos of, right? There's nothing threatening about that in terms of Jewish, whatever political side you're on. I mean, High is actually about resettling immigrants as opposed to letting folks across the border who have no means of livelihood, right? It's not arguing that we should increase numbers or lower numbers, or it's celebrating taking responsibility for those that choose to make their home here or that we welcome. So.
Right. It's the most frequently mentioned commandment in Torah is to welcome the stranger. And so that was, for our ancestors who came from Eastern Europe, at least, an incredibly important organization. And it continues to, like I said, probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Jewish organizations in the United States.
And if this fellow had known what he was doing, he could have wreaked even more carnage and damage if he stopped at our place, God forbid, right? On the way there. It's bigger, it's more historic, it's right off the street. I mean, it clearly was that this got into his craw, this piece of immigration rhetoric, right? The anti-immigrant piece. While we can't make a direct line or direct correlation between any given political speech, any given action, it's clear that it set the stage for these ideas becoming action.
So let's fast forward to the week, the Shabbat following. So you've got this crazy week. I remember talking to you about, when we saw each other the next month, just about the 24/7 cycle. You were on a lot of national news, and it was really filled. All of us were so filled with pride that our friend and colleague, I mean, if there was any one of us who, God forbid this should ever happen, meant to respond to such a thing, it would be you, because you're so articulate and you're a smart guy, and you're an above average dresser, and that's so let's move to the next Shabbat, and I want to move to the ecumenical piece a little bit and talk about who showed up that next Shabbat, and then talk about Mrs. Fred Rogers and what she said from your bima.
Yeah, thank you. So that week was as chaotic and as complete grief-stricken as was the city, right? And the Jewish community. We did 4 of the funerals in our building. Our sanctuary is one of the larger, and we just made it available that we should do that. The first was for Cecil and David Rosenthal, the 2 brothers.
Who have roots here, actually. They have family here.
Okay. The thing that, these occasions, these shootings, particularly when they're in Jewish settings, so whether it's a Parkland public school in a very Jewish neighborhood, or Pittsburgh or Poway or what have you, or JCC's here, obviously we find these connections, right? It's sort of an amazing web, sort of accelerates the game of Jewish geography in terms of who knew when, who knew whom, or who grew up where, or what. It could have been me, that kind of experience. So we did 4 of the funerals, and then that Friday across the country, right, was a call to show up for Shabbat. And people would have done that sort of impulsively, but there was also a general sense that was going to be something, right, across the country. And everyone by now had those 11 on their Kaddish list, and it was a international kind of grieving. We had Israeli diplomats in Pittsburgh that week who hung around to be there for Shabbat. They were sort of flying the colors. I mean, there were some in the community, the national, international community, were rather opportunistic about making sure I don't begrudge them, but they were clearly in Pittsburgh that week in order to say that we were in Pittsburgh that week. And there were others who just came out of the woodwork to be together and to be with their family. So putting together that Friday evening service was orchestrating something quite significant. We knew we would have media with us. And I hit on the idea of reaching out to Joanne Rogers, who just passed away. She had a beautiful obituary in the New York Times. She was just lovely. A few years ago, we had honored, just before the movies began coming out, we had honored Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, posthumously. And I had become friends as a result with Joanne, his widow, who was just a lovely human being and really became sort of the personification of his memory in bringing his message of just goodness and accepting people, liking you just the way you are, you know. And if you Google any of the stuff about Mr. Rogers, just to afford yourself a couple minutes of really feeling good, his simple message just resonates. So I thought that I should reach out to Joanne and invite her to be with us for Shabbat, and perhaps she would just have a message for the congregation, for the community, given what we've gone through in the last week. And she did. She spoke. I started with sort of coming up and sort of taking off a cardigan sweater and putting on a different one and changing my shoes because Fred Rogers would tape Mr. Rogers' neighborhood right across the street. The WQED, which is the first public television station, is just across the street from us. And so it's very much his neighborhood, which made it all the more poignant, right? And then the story is, let's just end this with a nechemta, which is a bit of hope, and is that the story is, and you saw it, Pittsburgh, really Jewish Pittsburgh represented itself so well, and the ecumenical community, the bishops that came out, the leader of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, right? You remember, created a GoFundMe page to pay for funerals, or offered to be the security at Jewish funerals. And it was just a wonderful outpouring, which revealed what those of us in Pittsburgh already know. But just to put a capstone on it, we know something about, we Jews, right? Temples being destroyed, or synagogues being desecrated, or Jews being gunned down. And we know something about authorities and civic leaders and other religious elites standing back and watching it happen. But in Pittsburgh, the story was very different. The American response, we take credit for it in Pittsburgh, but it's a reflection, I think, of, I'm not unique in doing ecumenical work, or certainly the Reform movement, right? You've had lots of sharings with neighbors in a way that reflects our appreciation of what a community is comprised of. We don't choose to segregate ourselves and live behind ghetto walls any longer. And so the first time in Jewish history in America, in Pittsburgh, the response was that the religious leaders came together to support the Jewish community, to stand with us. The political leaders did the same thing. And think what you will about the President of the United States. He came to demonstrate the significance of what this meant to the fabric of our country, that this had happened. So that's something to take with us, right? It's a scary world, but our experience here is different than other times in history.
So I guess my last question before we open it up to the group, Aaron, is what changed? And it sounded like it didn't need an event like this to bring a community together, because the community was already together, both within the Jewish community and the ecumenical community. But maybe something's changed. And what really hasn't changed, or what was the, now we're 2 years and several months later. Obviously, conspiracy theories haven't changed. Obviously, white supremacist, neo-Nazi behaviors have, I believe the ADL, when they produced their 2019 acts of anti-Semitism report from 19, which came out about a month ago, everything obviously is on the increase. But within Pittsburgh, what changed, what hasn't changed, what's been an improvement? Has there been any setbacks? And what is Tree of Life right now? So that's a lot of questions, but I'm actually very curious. I heard that they're building something, but I wanted to know a little bit.
Right. So Tree of Life has been a tenant in our building since that week.
Wow.
Right. And because they didn't have access to their building for the first however many months, and then it was, I haven't been inside the building since, but I gather it was just a terrible, terrible crime scene. And you can imagine a congregation of a certain age, of dwindling membership, long deferred maintenance anyway, right? So they moved into our building, and for the first 9 or 10 months, I think the rent was paid by insurance. Just sort of an interesting piece of this. You can imagine if you couldn't have access to your own congregation, what that might require. And then they began thinking about what to do with the building, or what to, right? And I'd like to describe that they were pinned between two sensibilities. We all appreciate by now that in Israel, when there's a terrorist bombing, they clean up as quickly as they can, and they reopen the cafe, or they rehang the disco ball, and resilience requires they go forward. And we all sort of go, what strength the Israelis have, we tell ourselves. In the United States, we tend to raise the building. So no one would expect any parent to put their child back into Sandy Hook Elementary School, right? Because we don't do that, you know? And the building in Parkland that was the site of the shooting, that's being closed. No kids had a class in there since, right? They're gonna tear it down and put up a new building, because that's what we do. So now Tree of Life, there's sort of a Jewish-Israeli impulse that says if we don't rebuild and go back in, the terrorists win. And there's the American impulse that says this could be our machaya. I mean, God forbid, awful, but we can often take some insurance money from this. We can sell the property. It's in the heart of Squirrel Hill. We can endow something that will make sure that our flavor, our brand of Judaism continues. It was never about the building. Now, that's a possibility of real imagination. I mean, for a while they were talking with, there's a university across the street called Chatham, a formerly women's college, but right, they would love to think about that building as they expand their Jewish community and the Holocaust Center, and thinking creatively. I happen to think, this is just Bisno talking, that it's sort of an ill-begotten, particularly now, boondoggle to try to raise tens of millions of dollars to memorialize that building, as opposed to putting those energies into something more collaborative. And so there was a moment right afterwards where we were all coming together. For the first time, Reform and Orthodox rabbis sat in the same room to get community briefings, right? I mean, there's this cracking open of the community such that we were pulling together, and there were real possibilities about what this could mean or what this would require of us. 2 years later, we've sort of reverted back to norm, and that's the propensity, I think, of human beings. It turns out we're not only resilient, we get back to business, but we fall back into patterns, because change itself is really a challenge, right? So in some ways, the more things change, the more they remain the same. But we're certainly in a post-Pittsburgh congregational landscape, right? I'm sure it affects decisions made in your boardroom too, right? Because
well, let's just say that the budget line for security went from roughly $15,000-$20,000 to $180,000 overnight. So,
right.
So that's, obviously one of the things that many synagogues, including large synagogues or
Sure.
well endowed synagogues, just weren't prepared for, because we just simply don't, have the infrastructure to figure that out. But we figured it out, and our members obviously pay about 40 to 50% of that through some fees and so on and so forth. Let's Rabbi, unless there's anything else that you want to add, let's get some questions going here.
Great.
So please don't forget to unmute yourself. Maybe I have to ask you to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Am I
There
unmuted?
you go. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm Felice Sentius, and my husband Wayne and I are fairly new members of the congregation. And then we hit COVID, everything stopped. But one of the reasons, and I got to say why we joined, is because we were taking out all Reformed synagogues in the Scottsdale area, because our children now live here. And we had heard a Rabbi Kahn sermon over a year ago. It just spoke to us, and we joined. And that was him, and that was it, and it was great. And what happened on this past Friday night, Rabbi Kahn, I mean, maybe he does it every Friday night, I don't get there, but he did it again. He had the most intense, I mean, we sat at home at the edge of our chairs listening to his sermon Friday night, and it was about what you're talking about, Rabbi Bisno. It was about it was about anti-Semitism. It was about being nervous and being scared and all these conspiracies and what do we do with them and what are we thinking and where do we go? And so I'm listening to your words of the Pittsburgh. By the way, my dad was from Pittsburgh, so I'm familiar with your area. What now? What's going on with us now? What can we do? We have a new president, hopefully a new outlook. Hopefully we just had our COVID shots the other night here in Scottsdale. So things are looking up and I want to be optimistic, but it's hard. It's hard. We're really dealing with a lot of issues. And so with your knowledge of what you went through, how do you move out of it? Does time get you out of it? Or is there some active thing that we can be doing to make sure that Jews be protected?
Are you looking for encouragement or how Jews can be protected?
I'm looking for some optimism, I guess. Going forward, hopefully there'll be some new ways of looking at things and thinking about things. And I guess with what you went through, how did your congregation then just move forward from being scared and being really under the gun, intimidated?
Yeah, you know, it's amazing. Rabbi Kahn's compliment that of all of our friends, it should be me or something because I'm so articulate. It turns out that what I discovered, and I'm sure we found this too, those of us who've lived long enough, if you will, right, that very often it's a simple word or effort that or just being present and sharing the experience of being sad, right? The poet, my favorite poet is Rainier Maria Rilke, and Rilke talks about the responsibility we have as human beings to learn how to be with the one who is sad. To be with the one who is sad, to not say I know how you feel, but I'm with you. I'm thinking of you. I'm right. Turns out in my sermon, the high holiday sermon, the year later, right, so 19. I spoke. Do you remember when hugs replaced handshakes, right?
Yeah.
Or do you remember when we let people in Pittsburgh? You make the Pittsburgh left, which is when the light turns green, you're allowed to make the left in front of the people coming forward. But that requires the person who has the right of way to allow. So we joked that for a while we were letting 2, maybe 3 people make the Pittsburgh left. Everyone was just a little bit more patient, a little bit more gracious, you know. There aren't words in some cases, right? I mean, if you want a theological explanations, it's a different conversation, it's a different teaching. It may not be satisfying, right? Do you remember, it's a Christian theologian, but C.S. Lewis wrote a little monograph the year after his wife died called A Grief Observed. And in it, he talks about, there are 2 real takeaways. One, he says he never realized how much grief would feel like fear, which is interesting, right? So when you grieve a loved one or a marriage, or, I mean, there's a lot of fear tied up in grief, and that's fascinating to begin to explore that, right? So as we're sad, we're also very frightened. It feels vulnerable to be sad, to be threatened, right? And the other thing he says, speak to me of the comforts of religion. Remember, he's in the first year of his wife's passing. Speak to me of the comforts of religion, and I'll know you do not understand. And so I'm reminded that it's not time for an explanation of why it happened, or here's the silver lining and what looks like a tragedy today, you know, but rather the simple word, being present, being patient. That's what I discovered. So I like to think of myself as articulate and well-dressed, but it turns out that if you're a little bit humble and a little bit patient and a little bit silent, you know, that goes a long way. And that's what our community sort of discovered, is that it touched all of us. We also learned, because it's fascinating what happens, the federal government comes in, the Justice Department sets up a center for a resiliency center, such that if victims need immediate financial help with a funeral, or they have immediate financial need because the breadwinner was gunned down in what's now a federal crime. And then they stick around because they know that 20%, in the next 36 months, 20% of the zip code area, right, will have some psychological or mental health need. I mean, these are things that continue to reverberate. And, you know, the affiliation rate here is such that, obviously, I don't know everybody who's suffering these ways, but people still are. Come anniversary, or they lost friends, and it makes no sense. She survived the Holocaust and loses her life at a Shabbat service, right? So it causes all of us to think these really significant questions that push us to confront our own mortality and vulnerability.
Rabbi Bisno, I remember
Thank you.
something you said triggered something that I was thinking about. I think it was the Wednesday, 9/11 was a Tuesday. So on Thursday night, September 13th, we had just sort of a community service moment of grief and it's a very Jewish thing, like you said. Within 48 hours, we had organized after the Pittsburgh shooting. Here, we hosted a community service, had over 1,000 people, all of the clergy, ecumenical. It was really beautiful.
Yes.
I put the link in the comment area. But I remember after 9/11 giving a talk that night about sadness and mourning, and not jumping on or into that impulse of let's go bomb them, let's go kill them, let's, And I remember a couple people being critical of that, saying, no, we should go attack. It was like Pearl Harbor. We should have the Rooseveltian day live in infamy and go to war. And I said, but the Jewish idea in mourning is actually to separate ourselves. Sadness and anger are the same. Anger is more organizing. It's definitely gets us focused on the enemy and we've been attacked and who we should go after. Whereas sadness, and what I hoped that I articulated on Friday night, which is the being in the uncertainty as you're talking about mourning. The second line you said about religion, religion, if anything, Bible stories in particular, teach us about uncertainties and tolerating the ambiguities of life.
Exactly.
So I really appreciated both the question, but the answer as well.
Yeah, I'll respond to both of those.
But go ahead, Aaron.
Well, Steve Goldston, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good to see you. I think you remember my sister Jan Goldston at Rodef Shalom.
Yes.
And I grew up with Rabbi Weiss, of course. You've been speaking about the micro effects, what we can do individually and so forth. But I don't think you can forget about the macro, which is on a world and country basis. One of the biggest macro problems, I think, today is the lack of religion. If we look at Europe today, religion is really a very minor part of the fabric of their society. And look where all the hatred and anti-Semitism really has grown up in the last 10 or 15 years. It's come out of Europe. The second thing is I've noticed in this country over the last, and I'm not going to say 4 years, I'm going to say longer than that, a tendency to ignore the law on an institutional basis. And what comes to mind is sanctuary cities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's laws on the books, and cities have created sanctuary cities out of righteousness of the leaders, but yet that's against the law. Once you say the law is not valid in this case, then who's to say it's not valid in that case or another case? The third thing is, and this is, I think, most important, what's happened in the last 4 years, is a lack in the basic tenets of the founding of this country. Or thumbing the nose at the Constitution, or even by some saying that the entire founding of this country was not what it was in 1776, but some hyped up what it was in 1619, which is preposterous.
Okay.
And also, lastly, a degradation of the founding fathers themselves and their motives and what they've done by having a group of people, an extraordinary group of people at an extraordinary time that one could say God put them all together for a purpose. Just like Abraham, Isaac, we're studying Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
I got you.
The litany, well, they were there for a purpose. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. So let me respond quickly if I can. You touched on a lot. You're in good company with regard to your thoughts about the lack of religion across Europe. Pope Francis and before him Pope Benedict agree. And there's, in some ways, they're ahead of the curve in terms of the lack of religion in the United States, right? I don't think that per se is the direct correlation between that and anti-Semitism so much as just ignorance. I know that in Pennsylvania, I don't know what it is in Arizona. In Pennsylvania, the number of high school students who don't know anything about the Holocaust is scary, right? We're not talking about Israel. We're not talking about social issues. I'm going to acknowledge what happened in the 20th century such that they don't have a history or memory of it. And we're at our own peril as American citizens if our kids don't know that basic history, don't know why it's so off-putting when there's anti-Semitic t-shirts in the Capitol. That kind of thing, right? What's that about? Why is that horrible? For that matter, let's just pile on upwards, push back against you, Steve, a little bit. The same thing could be said about Confederate flags, right? That image in the Capitol should send chills down people's spine. However, if you don't know the history, you don't have that. So I think we've got plenty of ignorance before religion or the lack thereof even comes in. But I empathize with the fact that congregational affiliation across the religious American landscape is faltering. In terms of defending policy, I'm not here to defend policy, sanctuary cities or immigration policy or the rest, simply suggesting that the Jewish impulse to recognize and identify with the stranger, the immigrant, the vulnerable, the least, the last, the lost among us is part of our DNA. That's not to say we should or shouldn't build a wall. It's not to say we should or shouldn't allow asylum. It's not to say we should or shouldn't do any given ban or whatever, only to say that as Jews, there's nothing, being anti-immigrant as a position is the furthest thing from our approach, right? Yeah. And then as for the Constitution, everyone thinks they're defending the Constitution. I mean, that everyone thinks they're defending the Constitution. And so that we could talk more about that, who actually is, or what it actually they're defending, or where the threats lie. But I want to get back to, because I want to say it's not always so clear. But I do want to get back to what Rabbi Kahn was saying, and it's partly what I want to say to you too, Steve, is about our tolerance for uncertainty or ambiguity. Rilke, again, I'll quote my poet, right? Rilke says, love the questions themselves and live long into the answers. I translate that as be careful about trading really good questions, such as sanctuary cities, for instance. Be careful of trading really good questions for facile answers. Most of these issues don't really lend themselves to really facile answers on either side. So a pox on everyone's house, but let's be more thoughtful than simply being knee-jerk and glib. I'm not suggesting you are. I only mean to suggest that any of these ideas lend themselves to simple solutions. We should really love the questions themselves. So we're asking the questions is the important part. Now let's figure out how to make this a more perfect union by figuring out the best solutions we can come up with. Is that fair? Yeah. And the other, what I would say that a professor of comparative religion one time said to me that Christianity is comfortable with paradox, a virgin birth, eternal life, right? A man born with no sin, that idea. Christianity is comfortable with paradox, and Judaism is comfortable with ambiguity. We'll leave the question open. We don't need to resolve that. When the Messiah comes, we'll learn the answer. I mean, right? That's a big part of what allows us to have the elasticity, so that this and that can be understood as part of the tradition, as part of the words of the living God.
Beautiful, beautiful. We have about 10 minutes left, so Sam Klein, please, you're up next.
Polls have shown that at least 45%.
Hi.
I'm sorry,
Hello.
Sam, go ahead.
Polls have shown that at least 45% of adults
Good or bad?
don't know anything about the Holocaust. And also,
Awesome.
Arizona has just passed a law where the Holocaust must be taught between the junior, middle schools and high schools. Some of them have already done it. I know that the school that my granddaughter went to did a terrific job teaching about the Holocaust to those kids.
It's important. It's important.
Yeah.
Right. It'll be interesting to know how last week will be taught, or the week before, whatever it was, right? I mean,
right.
How that history gets written, what
Right.
lessons we draw from it. right? Without pointing fingers at each other, just what lessons do we draw? How do we come so close to something that's so antithetical to the entire political spectrum, even as there's conspiracy folks on the edges, right?
Other questions?
Rabbi.
Please,
Please.
Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Rabbi, you were mentioning, Rabbi Bisno, that you became good friends with Joanne Rogers. And then with all the wonderful commentary today, we got in a different direction. Could you go ahead and tell us what you gleaned and what you'd like to share from her as per what she said to continue on in her husband's memory?
Good. Thank you. That's really a lovely opportunity. I had a privilege to get to know her and her family, right? And as one of the generation that grew up with Mr. Rogers, it felt just incredibly special to they would sort of close that circle with them. She was just an incredibly gentle, thoughtful person. Maybe, you know, Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister by training who decided to make his ministry children's television. And so maybe it was the fact that she was, if you will, a preacher's wife, or sort of understood, or wasn't, I don't know, off-put or in any way bedazzled by what that might mean to be friends with a rabbi, you know, that kind of thing. And she was just very kind. I mean, people would come up and introduce themselves, and she sort of understood that her job in those moments were to be gracious and to thank them and to let them know that they were appreciated. You had her full attention, right? Simple, gentle things. There's certain people have this kind of charisma, right? That you feel better when you're with them than when you're not. And Joanne Rogers was just a beautiful human being that way. And she graciously carried on Fred Rogers' legacy. You know, it wasn't really, that was his job. It wasn't her life. But after his death, she became the representation, right? And it was then in those last, he passed away just before I came here, so 19 years or so, not larger in life, but the hagiography around him grew, right? Such that we now think of him and we feel fortunate to have known this man, or felt like we knew him, right? Who created this genre of children's television or of educational programming. And I feel very fortunate to have.
I mean, part of his innovation, I think you would agree, you knowing them better, was he was sort of a disruptive innovator in regard to his platform, because he saw what kids were seeing on TV, and he knew that poorer kids were watching television as a babysitter sometimes, and they were seeing all this other violent or sort of inappropriate content, and he wanted to create the alternative to that, because he knew that kids were watching television and wanted to give them. Felice, I wanted to go back to Felice's point too, because I think that in all of this, you know, if we're looking for the nechemta, where do we go? It's intellectually satisfying to say, well, toleration of ambiguity, understanding there are more questions than answers, all of those things. And a couple times on Friday night, I interrupted myself and said, I hope I'm not sounding trite, because I was using expressions like toleration of ambiguity and so on. What do you think? I guess I would say, as clergy in general, what I mean, look, you've met the Pope, you've been to Rome, you've received an award from Pope Benedict, I believe. And
there's all the same trip he's referring to.
But what do you think about what can we do? What have you learned from your relationships with non-Jewish clergy? Because I think Felice would be, not just Felice, I don't mean to pick on you, Felice, but I mean, when we're looking for what's the happy outcome, or how do we get to that outcome? I think one of our primary jobs, and I didn't think this 10 years ago, roles, I should say, not jobs, roles, is the relational piece with the broader community, specifically with the non-Jewish community. And what have you learned from that, and where's that gone?
Well, so let me say, thank you. Okay, so let me say this quickly. The time I met the Pope, or was introduced to the Pope, was when I was already in Rome. So those shouldn't be like, right, I don't want double dip. I met the Pope and I went to Rome. I had to.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And it's the emeritus Pope, not the one we all like. And he's never written or called since. So I want to be very clear. I don't want to overstate our friendship. But the official photographer took a picture. Okay, what have I learned? You know, I have been attending, Steve, I don't know whether you were with me the year we were in Israel. On Christmas Eve, I went into the old city and maybe we did together, went to Christmas Eve Mass. And I've been doing it every year since, for the last 30 years. This year, wasn't able, I did it online this year. Because I think it's beautiful. I think that I find it just inspiring as a sort of religious pageantry. I hear good preaching. I'm not critiquing the service the way I would inevitably if I were to attend in your place, you know, that's really good. I should take that back with me, or I would do that differently or whatever, right? So, and when I know the person who's leading it, the priest, the pastor, the bishop, who's leading, it's all the more meaningful. And it's always him, and for him as well, right? In terms of being supportive. And the bishop, at least in Pittsburgh, comes to Kol Nidre with us. And we both describe it to each other as enhancing our own understanding of our faith tradition and our own prayer and worship. And it gives us a sense of being supported in this because the themes are universal, right? There are particularistic things such that, you know, you're sitting in a Catholic service versus a Jewish service, and there's idioms and language and theology that's uniquely each of ours. And yet there's a lot that's really the plumb line that's the universal, and which is mostly gathering together, sharing rituals with which we're familiar, that orient us and that tether us and that resonate at certain frequencies for us because of with whom we've shared it in the past and who's no longer here, and all the kinds of things, Lador Vador, that's part of Christianity too, right? They just don't know the language in the Hebrew. So for me, that's very gratifying and reassuring. And then we, having respected each other or shared celebrations with each other or been in each other's homes in that way, feel much more inclined to find things that we have in common beyond that, right? Whether just sharing social time and coming to know each other, or being able, I don't want to drop a name in this way, but our local bishop was the lead plaintiff when the Catholic bishop sued Catherine Sebelius about Obamacare and funding reproductive issues, you know? And so being able to have a conversation at our level on constitutional law about freedom of religion versus the Establishment Clause is only possible when you trust each other, right? Or when I wrote a letter a couple years ago about gay marriage, giving the bishop a heads up so he shouldn't be blindsided. You're going to want to retort, you know, that kind of thing. It's been incredibly gratifying. And then when the shit hits the fan, right? They're there for you. These are friends. These are family. And
yeah, beautiful.
Beautiful.
So I want to thank Rabbi Bisno so much for joining us today, and just say again, Aaron, how on a personal level and professional level, how I aspire to do more and better works, especially in the ecumenical world. And you know, we had a beautiful Torah study this last. We've had a relationship that our cantor has really nurtured with Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, which is a primarily Black church in downtown Phoenix. And we had about 40 or 50 of their members with us for MLK Shabbat and studying Torah together. And you're right, when we talk text, and when we're talking about whether it's MLK's sermon from the mountaintop, or the sermon about I've seen the mountaintop and Moses going up to the mountaintop. And I mean, it's we're not at that level yet where we're having dinner, but we're getting there. And I can say the DNA of this congregation from Rabbi Plotkin of blessed memory, who went to Notre Dame, who was close with the bishop, whoever the bishop would have been, you know, it's such a wonderful world when we're able to have those relationships. And I think it sets such a wonderful tone and example for what life can really be about. And so thank you so much for sharing and for processing through these wounds that I'm sure are still there, and for your leadership afterwards. Just a quick advertisement, then we're going to close up because we are exactly at 1 o'clock. Next Tuesday, Susie Sachs will be joining me for our next conversation. And Susie is, well, you'll get the information this week, but we're going to talk about epidemiology. We're going to talk about not just that word, but many of the scientific words and concepts that we hear 24/7. And she's going to give us some very basic definitions and ways of going about our conversations. Of course, we'll talk about the vaccine, but as you know, we've been trying to do lots of informational sessions in these settings about the vaccine. and about the real and the scientific from the unsubstantiated. And so Susie's going to set us straight and answer some of the questions left over from last week when we met with Dr. Sonnenschein and Rabbi Weiner. Again, Aaron, thank you so much. And I will see everyone next Tuesday, if not sooner.
Good. Thanks all.
Thanks, Aaron. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.